If you're a software engineer looking at the job market in 2026, you've probably noticed that salaries can look very different depending on where you live.
In the US, tech salaries can get pretty crazy, especially once you move into mid-level and senior positions. But over in Europe, things look a little different.
Salaries are generally lower, but you also have things like public health care, more vacation time, and a different cost of living. So, how much are software engineers actually making in 2026? Today, we're comparing software engineering salaries in 4 countries: the United States, Germany, the Netherlands, and Poland. We'll look at what junior, mid-level, and senior engineers can expect to earn, how much of that money actually ends up in their pockets, and whether those huge US salaries are really worth it once you take everything else into account. Let's get into it. Let's start with the US, because this is where things get really interesting. Software engineering is still one of the highest paying careers in the country, and the numbers can get pretty impressive. In 2026, junior engineers are making a median salary of around $100,000. Once you reach mid-level, that jumps to roughly $170,000, while senior engineers are sitting at around $189,000. And if you make it to staff level, especially at companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, or Databricks, total compensation can go from around $225,000 to well over $350,000. But there's an important detail here. A lot of that number isn't necessarily your salary. U.S. tech compensation often includes stock and other forms of equity, so a $250,000 compensation package doesn't mean you're taking home $250,000 in cash. And then there's the cost of living. If you're working in places like San Francisco, New York, or Seattle, rent alone can take a pretty big chunk of your paycheck. Healthcare can also be expensive, and compared with many European countries, there's less of a social safety net. And then there's federal tax. The U.S. uses 7 tax brackets, from 10% all the way up to 37%. On top of that, most states add their own income tax too. Though a few, like Texas and Washington, charge none at all, which is one reason so many tech companies are based there. So yes, the U.S. definitely has the highest earning potential of the 4 countries we're looking at. But the big question is, how much of that money do you actually get to keep? Now let's move over to Germany. Germany has one of the biggest tech markets in Europe, but the way engineers are compensated is quite different from the U.S. The national median total compensation for software engineers is around 81,495 euros. Entry-level engineers start at roughly 57,000 euros, while senior engineers across the country have a median base salary of around 89,000 euros to 93,000 euros. And if you land a senior position in places like Berlin or at a US tech company in Munich, salaries can go much higher, with some positions reaching 140,000 euros to 200,000 euros. But there's one major difference compared with the US. Equity isn't nearly as common. Around 4 out of 5 German software engineers report receiving no stock compensation, meaning that most of your income is simply coming from your salary. That might sound like a disadvantage, but there's another side to it. Germany's income tax is progressive too, starting at 0% on the first roughly 12,000 euros and climbing all the way up to 45% for the very highest earners. Most software engineers land somewhere in the middle of that range, closer to 30 to 42%. On top of income tax, you'll also pay social contributions, things like health insurance, pension, and unemployment insurance, which add up to roughly 20% of your gross salary. The good news is that most higher earners no longer pay the old solidarity surcharge either, since it was largely scrapped for around 90% of taxpayers. Germany offers strong job protections, around 30 days of paid vacation, and comprehensive health care. So even though the gross salary might look lower than what you'd see in the US, you're also not paying for everything out of pocket. It's basically a different trade-off. Less upside, but more stability. Next up is the Netherlands. Amsterdam has become one of Europe's biggest tech hubs, with companies like Booking.com, Uber, and Adyen, as well as high-paying trading firms such as Optiver. Across the country, the median total compensation is around 89,987 euros.
But if you're working as a senior engineer in Amsterdam, that number rises to roughly 107,098 euros. And some of the salaries in Amsterdam's trading industry can get pretty wild. At the top end, total compensation can reach 350,000 euros or more. But salary isn't the only reason the Netherlands is interesting, especially if you're moving there from another country. Dutch income tax has just two effective brackets for most workers, around 35.75% up to about 39,000 euros, then a jump straight to 49.5% above that. That first bracket sounds high, but it actually includes your Social Security contributions bundled in. The real income tax portion of it is closer to 8%. There's the 30% ruling, which can give qualifying skilled migrants a significant tax advantage by allowing part of their income to be received tax-free for a limited period. For a senior engineer earning around 80,000 euros, that ruling alone can save roughly 10,000 euros a year, bringing your effective tax rate down to somewhere in the mid-30s, instead of pushing toward that 49.5% top rate. Add in good public infrastructure, widespread English proficiency, and a strong work-life balance, and the Netherlands becomes a pretty interesting middle ground between the US and the rest of Europe. You might not get the same salary ceiling as the US, but you can still earn very well while getting some of the benefits that come with living in Europe.
And finally, we have Poland. Poland has changed quite a bit over the last few years. It started out as a major outsourcing destination, but cities like Warsaw, Krakow, and Wrocław have developed into serious engineering and tech hubs. The salaries are obviously lower than what we've seen so far. The average software engineer salary is somewhere between 120,000 zlotys and 235,000 zlotys gross per year. For senior engineers at local companies, salaries can reach around 200,000 to 350,000 zlotys. But there's an important exception. If you work for a US multinational or one of the big tech companies with engineering centers in Poland, senior and staff-level compensation can go beyond 400,000 zlotys and even reach 600,000 zlotys or more. And this is where Poland gets interesting. The salaries might look low compared with the US or Western Europe, but the cost of living is also significantly lower. Depending on the city and your lifestyle, living costs can be around 25% to 40% lower than in Western Europe. There are also different tax and B2B contracting options that can work in an engineer's favor. Unlike traditional employment, B2B contracts often allow engineers to opt for a flat tax rate, resulting in a much lower overall tax burden and more control over deductions. Software engineers on an employment contract pay a progressive tax, 12% up to a certain income threshold, jumping to 32% above it. But under a B2B contract, most software engineers opt for a lump sum tax of just 8.5 or 12%. Some, working under the IP box regime, pay as little as 5% on qualifying income. So even though you earn less on paper, you may actually be able to save a larger percentage of your income. So, after looking at all 4 countries, where would you actually want to work as a software engineer in 2026? The US is pretty clearly the winner if your main goal is maximizing your income. The salaries are much higher, and the combination of high base pay and equity gives you a lot of potential upside. Germany is a different story. You're giving up some of that earning potential, but in exchange, you get more stability, strong employee protections, paid vacation, and comprehensive health care. The Netherlands might be the middle ground. Salaries can be quite high, especially in Amsterdam, and tax benefits like the 30% ruling can make it particularly attractive for international engineers. And then there's Poland. You won't make as much in absolute terms, but the lower cost of living can make those salaries go a lot further. And if you manage to land a role with a multinational or work remotely for a foreign company, the numbers become even more interesting. So, if you had to choose one of these 4 countries to work in as a software engineer in 2026, which one would you pick? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.